Good evening, woodworkers. This evening we're not going to talk about how to build joints, how to plane wood, how to saw, or anything like that that takes place in the shop. This evening we're going to talk about how to photograph your woodwork. Note that I have long sleeves, my shirt's hanging out, I'm not worried. Actually, studio photography is pretty easy. It requires a few pieces of equipment to set up, and a few things to know about lighting. And if you have all that in mind, you have that equipment, and it's not a lot of equipment, you can do studio photography. So we're going to go through that, and at the end of this, hopefully you'll be able to go into your wood shop or studio or wherever it is you do this photography and successfully take pictures of your woodworking products. Usually the first thing we talk about when we talk about photography is cameras. And while cameras are obviously an important tool, they're the tool, they're not really the photography. And I want to emphasize that because in a lot of ways, what you are doing in the studio is setting up and designing your shot, lighting your shot. At the very last step, you're pulling out your camera and setting it up and fitting your shot within the rectangle of the camera. Now, technically, you can use any of these cameras to do studio photography. They're not all necessarily built for studio photography, but they're usable. Just like the digital cameras you have now. We're going to talk about two cameras specifically, and we'll talk about them in the studio, but I just want to mention them here. One of them is a smartphone. The reason I want to talk about that is you all have it. You don't have to go out and buy one. You can use the smartphone as your camera. It requires a few things. You may have to look at things a little differently, but it won't change your lighting setup. It won't change the equipment you use, but it might change how you take the picture. And that's a small thing. The other camera we'll use is a DSLR, which means digital single lens reflex. The single lens reflex is the camera that you've seen all over the place, and many of you probably have one. You've used it on vacation, you have probably taken some pictures of your woodworking with them, and they're fairly easy to use if you do certain things. The digital SLR allows you to make changes in aperture or shutter speed, if necessary, that can change the way the product looks. So it has a little more freedom for you. You're not stuck within the confines of the smartphone and the limitations that its setup provides for you. So we're going to divide this workshop into several pieces. One of them, the first thing, is this, the introduction. Then we're going to go down to the studio, build the studio, set up all of the things that you need in order to do your studio lighting, and then after that we're going to go into what I call my dark room, which isn't a dark room, it has a computer in it, and we're going to look at the computer and see how these images need to be prepared for whatever you want to do with it. If you want to post these things online, we'll show how we do that on the smartphone and on the camera. If you want to make prints, we'll show you how to prepare for that. I don't think many of you want to make prints, but if you do, we'll go through a little bit of an exercise on doing that. So let's start doing this, and we're going to go to the studio. All right, now we're down in here in the studio, aka the spare room, the storage room, the junk room, whatever you want to call it. And everybody has one of these rooms. You know, it's where you store your luggage that you only use once a year, or your decorations that you only use once a year, but everyone has one of these rooms. This one happens to be 5 feet wide and about 8 feet from the curtains to the camera. We're going to use it to set up a small product studio. The ceiling here is pretty low. It's about 7 feet, but it doesn't really matter because we're only using a few inches above the tabletop. So we'll have plenty of room to set up the light and to set up reflectors and everything else. So let's start setting up. There, that was easy. Now, a little bit about the background paper. This paper is built specifically for this purpose. It comes in, this is a 48, or about a 48-inch wide piece of paper, and longer actually than you'll ever need in what you're doing, but it also comes wider, so if you're photographing bigger things and you have a bigger space than this, it works. But you can get them in Atlanta. There are a couple places, and I'll list them in our resources, or you can get them on Amazon and just have it sent straight to your door. These are Easy to store. As I said, the paper will last forever. It's a really tough paper. That roll costs about $25, $30, so it's portable. So before we start talking about lighting, we should talk about light. In our situation, light has three qualities that we want to take advantage of. The first is color. We just need to get the idea of color out of the way when we choose our lighting. The second one is quality. Is it a soft light? Is it a hard light? Is it a bare light bulb? Is it a bulb in a parabolic reflector that really focuses the light in front of you? And the third is direction. Where the light is coming from is important. And we'll talk more about that when we start setting up our product. So more than likely, we're going to be using a soft light in this particular situation. It works in a lot of situations. That's kind of the standard light that you'd see in product photography. And the standard tool used to create that light is a softbox. Now this, you'll see, has light in it. And that light is a modeling light. That is, the main light that comes out of that box is a very small electronic flash unit, the kind that you clip on top of an SLR camera. The light that's in there is just a set of LEDs I glued in there so I could see what I'm doing and get an idea of what the light is doing on my subject. The LEDs will not be instrumental in the photograph itself. You won't see them. You'll only see the electronic flash because it's much brighter. It will completely override the color of the LEDs. Either way, it gives me the same effect. So that's one thing. In this case, it's an electronic flash. This light is called a CFL. It's a compact fluorescent light. And the reason I have this light is that it is the correct color temperature for us to use in the studio. It's rated at 5,500 degrees Kelvin. I'll get to that in a second, which is equivalent to daylight. This is an LED panel, and this particular LED panel lets you dial between daylight and tungsten light. Okay, now let's get into these colors of light because they matter. Not only do they matter in how it reacts with the sensor in your camera, but it also matters in how it looks on your subject. You all use a camera that allows you to select the color of the light. AWB, automatic white balance. All right, that lets the camera decide what looks best in its opinion of the colors that it wants to provide for you. But you can also break that down further. You can choose tungsten light, and a tungsten light is exactly what it is, a light with a burning piece of metal in it that we have all grown up with, and that for a large part is kind of going away because it uses a lot of energy compared to an LED, and they can make LEDs in colors that look like tungsten. Probably the best tungsten light to use if you're doing photography is a tungsten halide light. Halide lights are very bright for one thing, but that's not really the quality that we're after, although it helps. But they also provide a full spectrum in between red and the blue. So red, green, and blue is a full spectrum because you get all the colors in between. This fluorescent, this compact fluorescent light will also do the same thing. It has phosphors in it that will put out red, green, and blue light in reasonable proportion. Now, one of the lights you're very used to is cool white fluorescence. Every office building in the world either has or has had until recently cool white fluorescent lights. And they're bright. They're bright because they're green. And green is the color that your eyes are most sensitive to. So if there's a lot of green in the light, it's going to look really bright. Unfortunately, when you photograph it using a daylight setting on your camera, it'll be green because it is green. What happens in your brain is that your brain says, oh, that's a really bright light. I think it'll be white. In other words, your brain uses an automatic white balance. And anything that it sees that looks off, in a few seconds it's going to make it on again. No matter what colors of light, as long as it's not one of the primaries that you're looking at, it will interpret as white. And that could be a problem in that you think it's white, but your camera will tell you something very different. So you have to be careful of that. LEDs are another story altogether, because they can be made to look like tungsten light or cool white lights or daylight. And the problem with that is that unless they're really expensive, they are not going to have a full spectrum. So what does that mean to you? Well, the sun puts out a full spectrum of color. Everything you could possibly want out of color, it has it in there, and it's pretty reasonably distributed, at least as far as your eyes can see. Now for a brief and hopefully painless explanation of color temperature and how it affects you when you're doing photography. Here you have a distribution of sunlight at midday, and you can see that this distribution is pretty even across all of the visible spectrum. You see the main colors, blue, green, and red, and then all of the colors that are derived as they mix over. From blue to green is cyan, from green to red is yellow. So how are we able to label these colors individually so that we know how much and what kind of color is coming out of a light bulb that we're using? We take it as a given, because it's actually the case, that the sun is between 5,000 and 6,000 degrees Kelvin. So it's pretty hot, but we know that that contains all of the visible light that we see. Now, I'm not a physicist, and I'm a really lousy mathematician, so using something called Planck's constant, whatever that is, physicists have been able to figure out that they can determine the locations of these degrees on the spectrum, and therefore we can label our bulbs according to that spectrum. So I'm not going to delve further into the theory of color temperature, but as you can see on this scale, the warmer color is, the lower the color temperature is. And this is sort of like heating a piece of iron with a torch and watching it go from red to yellow to green to blue, or however that goes. But we can see how we're using the labels to determine this color temperature. A tungsten light is about 3,200 degrees Kelvin. A fluorescent light is whatever we want it to be, really, because we can change the phosphors. As we look at this chart, we see a slightly better representation of what we can expect out of our light sources. So you see that even daylight changes color depending on the predominance of what's in the sky at the time. More blue sky, higher Kelvin temperature. Less blue sky, lower Kelvin temperature. You can see now in this next picture how a fluorescent light gives off a very bad representation of the spectrum. As a matter of fact, if you were to look at it compared to daylight, a fluorescent light would be bright green, because green is in the middle of the spectrum, and that's the color that you can see best, so it looks the brightest. A cool white is just almost straight green. So another measure that's used in describing a light bulb, in addition to color temperature, is the size of the spectrum that goes up to the color temperature, and that's called a CRI, or color rendering index. It's not a great measure because it only bases it on 8 different colors, but it's the best thing we have so far. So as you see here, the quality of the color that's reflected off of the subject improves as the CR approaches 100. It never actually gets to 100, but anything over 90 is pretty good. And how that translates into real-life room situations is that the colors are much brighter because there are more colors within the spectrum to bounce off of the subjects that you see in the room. The closer you have to the color that's coming out of the light source to what the color is in the picture, the more accurate a reproduction you will see in your eventual image. Okay, now we're ready to set up our shot. And as you see, a few changes in here to try to accommodate the lights that we use. I took that compact fluorescent light and put it into the softbox. Took out the electronic flash, put the compact fluorescent light in. And the reason I did that is that we're going to use an iPhone to do this, and it doesn't have a facility to use a flash, or at least to synchronize with outside flashes. And this is probably more like the type of lighting that you'll be using. Whether it's a compact flash or it's one of your quartz industrial lights, which work very well too, this is what you'll be using. We have our background paper, or our seamless, set up as we did before. Right now we have light coming in to light me, and this entire set, I'll be shutting that off when we actually take pictures. Here's our tripod. Note this little gizmo on top of the tripod. This holds the iPhone. I wouldn't recommend getting one of these. I'd recommend getting something that holds the iPhone a lot better than this one does, but this will work for our purposes. So it's set up on a tripod. Tripod's nothing special. It's a lightweight tripod. I have my handy dandy roll of gaffer's tape. It looks like duct tape, doesn't it? But it's not. And the advantage to using gaffer's tape rather than duct tape is that while it sticks really well, when it comes off it doesn't leave any adhesive anywhere, and it's not that hard to get off. Unless you're trying to take it off, it won't come off. and it's matte black. So if it's anywhere in your set, it won't be reflecting any light. So that's a great thing, and that's what you want. Not black duct tape, but gaffer's tape. You can get it on Amazon, you can get it in a photo store, or one that sells grip equipment or rents grip equipment. There's a big movie industry in this town, so there are companies that do that. I have my handy cans of dog food, which you will see later, and I have the box here suspended on a 2x4, and if you were to do this at home, make sure it's a warped Home Depot 2x4, because those are the best. And we can't use it for anything else. And I just made something that will hold that softbox on there. So, turning on our lights, we now have what we see as our set. I'm going to shut off the other light, so I'm going to be probably in silhouette as we go through this exercise. And I'm sitting here because I think my top of my head will go out of the shot if I stand up. Our subject is a bowl. I'm going to put it reasonably far back because I need some of that foreground. And I'm going to put the camera in. Now, I normally don't do that. The camera is usually the last thing in the world that I set up. And the reason is that it's not important in the lighting setup. Not important at all. So here it is, in front of the set. And you'll see what I mean by color temperature. The color temperature, obviously, of the screen of the iPhone is very different than what we have over here. That's one of the issues with color temperature. Now, what's on the screen of the iPhone doesn't really matter, because actually what's happening on the screen is a lot different color-wise than what you're seeing. So I have it set up. All I did was put the bowl in front there and set up the tripod. And there it is. It's a nice looking shot. It's pretty blah. But we start blah, and then we move on from there. I'm going to do a couple of things here, and one of them is to put a reflector inside the bowl. I have some reflector material, aka white board, but actually it's silver on the other side. Yeah, I don't want to use the silver side because that will give specular reflections or highlights, and I don't want to really put in any highlights. So I'll conform this piece of cardboard to the inside of the bowl, and I'll set it in there. And you probably can't see it right now. You'll see it in the finished image. But that will reflect light from the box onto the back of the bowl and lighten it up a little bit. The next thing I'll do is add a reflector. Now that you can see pretty well. Well, you could if the tripod weren't in the way. And we'll do the other side just to show you. And we want to add it in so it doesn't get in the way of the shot. It can be in the shot a little bit. This is where the dog food cans come in handy. We're going to hold it up. And the reason I say that the board can be in the shot a little bit is that we are going to crop in. The iPhone gives you a much wider image than what you actually want in your finished picture. You don't want a little bowl sitting in a big field of white. Okay, let's move a reflector into the other side, and you see what that does. Now, when I say you can do this with stuff that you have at home, I really mean it. So I'm not using any kind of special stands or clamps or anything else that you pay hundreds of dollars for at a film or photography store. Dog food cans, and if you want to use a can of beans, that's fine too. So we essentially have this set up, and although it's a blah shot, we're going to take a picture of it. So it's kind of a long exposure, and because of that, I'm going to use my watch app here on an Apple Watch. Release the shutter from here. Now, there are other things you could plug into the camera, or you can use the controls, the up and down controls on the phone to release the shutter. But I'd rather not touch this because the bracket holding the camera on the tripod doesn't hold it really tightly. And if I touch the camera, I may make it move. Shutter speed is probably long, so we're going to leave the camera alone and release the shutter. And so I have the shot. And to bring it up on the screen, there's the shot. Okay, dull, but it's okay. We'll get back to it. That's one shot. And what does that give us? It gives us a picture of a bowl, and that's it. And it's pretty dull. You have no idea what size that bowl is. But my hand on it, you can see what size it is. But my hand's not going to be in the photograph. What should we put in there? A set of keys? I've seen that a lot. A couple of coins? Yeah. Does that really go with it? Let's try to set this up so that it's an attractive shot that doesn't take away from the bowl itself. Okay, I raided the kitchen, got some fruit, and we're going to try to put some fruit in here, make it a little bit more interesting. A couple of apples, maybe a banana. Notice that that banana throws a little bit of a yellow reflection on the bowl, but in this case I don't think that will bother it that much. Let's haul out the old shutter release again, right here. Take another picture, and there. That gives you some scale, which is what you need in any kind of photograph like that, particularly individual photographs of your woodwork. It gives a little more interest to the bowl. A lot of people don't know what to do with a wooden bowl. What do you do with a wooden bowl? It's kind of like advertising clothes in photography. You don't just throw the clothes on the table, I've seen that, but you don't normally just throw the clothes on the table and say you have a picture of the clothes. People want to see it on somebody so they can picture it how it look on themselves, and that's why there are models. That's one way of doing it. So we have these nuts in the bowl, and we're lighting around the bowl like we did before. We're going to add this reflector in front. It's between the camera and the product, and this way we can see more what it looks like. But I would like to now talk about how to adjust the camera. As I said before, the camera is not the most important of all this, it's the lighting. The trouble is that you can't do it without the camera. There are a few things about the iPhone camera that you should know. So let's look at the way this iPhone camera is set up. Of course, you've always used them as a point and shoot, and that's just fine, but this might be a little different. When you're close up to your subject, there are a few things that you have to keep in mind. First of all, there is a setting on here that sets the zoom. Yes, you can pinch. It would zoom in and zoom out. But if you look at just to the side of the nut bowl, you can see the two lenses represented, 1x and 0.5. The 0.5 is a wide angle lens, as you can see there. The 1 is the normal lens. It's still wide angle, but it's more normal. There's another way to adjust that zoom, and that is to touch it, and you'll see a scale come up. And as you move your finger up and down on it, it shows you your zoom setting. Now bear in mind that when you zoom on an iPhone, you're not actually optically zooming. You're just making the image bigger on the phone, which cuts out some pixels on the way that it does that. This is exactly the same as taking the picture wide, recording it, putting it into your computer, and then changing the size of it so that it looks like this. Actually, that operation might be a little better because you don't have as much loss depending on the program you're using to make that enlargement. So, okay, we have it here. It's a little off kilter, I think, but we'll take it. And let's look at some other settings on this. At the top of the phone, you have 3 objects. One of them is the flash. By clicking on it, you can see the zigzag flash icon, and that turns the flash on. You can turn the flash off by tapping it again. On the other side is the live picture, and what that does is when you take the picture, it records a little bit before and a little bit after this center point of your picture. It does that in case there's movement, or if you're photographing a person and you want to get just the right part of their smile, or however you want to do that, you can then look at that picture and pick out the exact frame that you want. So in order to turn that on, you would tap live picture image, and to shut it off, you would tap it again, and you see the line goes through it. So in this case, we are not using the flash, and we are not using the live picture. There's another small object up there, and it's a pointer. If you tap on that, it'll point down, and when it does that, you see a whole new set of controls coming up on the right. The 2 at the bottom show the flash and the live picture. The 16:9 is the ratio of the width to the length of this photograph. It also gives you the opportunity to change it to a 4:3, which is the old 35 millimeter picture size. Tap it again, and we also can do a square. Now, a square is kind of handy in that if you do it that way, you can fit your image in either a horizontal or a vertical space. a little more easily. So it's up to you how you want to do this. I like using my full frame, but if you don't know how it'll fit into your eventual spot where you're going to place this image, then you might not want to do that. Okay, then you have a plus and minus sign up above that. And what that does, it controls your exposure. Okay, you get your exposure where you want it. Could go really bright. Could go really dark. Let's try something in the middle and tap that again. The next icon up is the self-timer. And if you choose it, it will give you the opportunity to set it on a 3-second timer or a 10-second timer. Now remember, before when I used the iPhone, I could release the shutter from my watch. Well, not all of you have this watch. In this case, I can choose 3 seconds, and when I take the picture, it has a 3-second lag, and then it takes the picture. Now, the reason this is handy is that when you have a camera in a more or less rickety stand, and really no matter how you're handling this camera, tapping it will cause it to vibrate. If the shutter speed happens to be low, and I don't really know what the shutter speed is on this at the moment, then the camera will vibrate, the picture will be fuzzy. So let's turn that off. That 3-second lag, or 10-second lag if you need 10 seconds, will wait for the camera to stop moving, and then it'll take the picture. And that's a really handy thing to have. Now, focus. In order to focus these cameras, and I'll take the controls off by hitting that little arrow or caret at the top. If I tap the screen somewhere, a square will come up briefly. And that square sets the location of your automatic focus. So I can do it in the nuts about halfway through. I could do it in the front. The camera will focus there. And this camera does actually focus. There's a little motor in the lens that moves the lens back and forth in front of the sensor. So this focuses on where you set that little square. If you want to set it on the back, it'll focus on the back. Anything up to 4.5 feet needs to be focused. So remember that. If, however, your camera is 4.5 feet away from your subject, everything will be in focus. So what we're talking about here is depth of field. The depth of field is kind of set in the lens when you're focusing near or far, because this lens always shoots wide open. If you have any experience in photography, you'll know what that means. If you don't, what it says is the lens is set to the least possible depth of field. And so any depth of field that you get only courtesy of your lens. So what I like to do is focus about 1/3 of the way into my image, because that's the best way to get anything toward the camera in focus and as much as possible away from the camera in focus. And then I can take my picture. But also, if you notice that square, there's a little picture of a sun next to it. And you can adjust the light intensity or the exposure with that instead of going to your camera controls. So we're going to change it up. This time we're going to bring in something bigger, a box, and we're going to try to light it a little differently. The light on the top works. I'm sure it'll be fine for this situation. Let's try to light it from the side. And the reason I'm saying that is that suppose you had something a little bigger, like a stool or a night table. What you would probably want to do is take the table out from under this setup, drop the seamless down to the ground, use a lower camera angle, and photograph the stool. The box won't be sufficient for that. So let's try a different kind of lighting. This time we're going to move the light over to the side and use another light as a fill. The reason we're going to do that is so we can get a broad light coming in from a direction. So let's try that now. Okay, as you can see, we changed it up quite a bit. We put the light over on the side, we put the box where we had the bowl before, and you can see that the light is very different. And the other thing we're going to change up is that we're going to change our camera to the DSLR. So this is a Canon 7D. It's kind of a standard single lens reflex, digital, I don't remember how many megapixels it is. but whatever it is, it's a whole lot more than the iPhone. And we'll be using this to do the rest of the shots today. You'll see some shots from this camera, and you'll also see how we can use it on the computer to manipulate the image. Not necessarily much, but some. Okay, so the other thing you'll see is that there's a light right here. So we're using two lights instead of reflectors. We have the main light here and the fill light here. The fill light puts out less light than the main light, and the reason for that is that we don't want two light sources throwing shadows in the photograph. We're used to having one sun in this particular solar system, and because of that, we're used to having a single direction of light. Anything else is to make up for the lack of light, and to do that, we want to make sure we don't have this fill light throwing separate shadows anywhere. Now, if we lived on Krypton, maybe we would need two main lights, but in this case, no. The light from the main light does spill all across the front of this, but not nearly as much. You can see what happens to the light in the front. Look at the shadows. See what happens to the shadows as well as the front face of the box. Okay, the front face of the box is lit, but the shadows didn't change, and that's the important piece of it. You don't want this particular light throwing its own shadows. So here we are. We'll set up the camera, we'll do a shot, and you can take a look at it. So there's the picture that we just shot. Now in this particular case, you'll see in a broad way that the box is surrounded by a field of white. When I zoom the video camera back, of course, that's not how you see it, but it is a fact that when we shot that image, it was surrounded by a field of white. In order to go more to black in our little room here, we would pull the table out so that there's more of a long sweep to the paper. And that way, with that long sweep, it'll be out of range of the light and it'll go black. Another way that we can do that is to mask off some of the light going to the background. We can do that with paper. Yeah, we can do it with something black. That might be better in this case. And manipulate it that way. One thing I want to mention here is that this paper, as you can see, is a little bit wrinkled as it goes up. There's nothing that I can do about that right now because it is wrinkled, it's done. So if you do buy a roll of this stuff, make sure you keep it in as little humidity as possible. And if you do that and it's tightly rolled, it shouldn't wrinkle. I mean, this roll of paper is over 10 years old, so maybe by 10 years it will wrinkle regardless. So take care of your stuff, particularly things that can go bad over time because of humidity. And this roll of paper will last you. If you don't want to deal with that background paper, wrinkled or straight, then there is this device, Supportable Studio. And I hear half you guys saying, why didn't you tell us about this before? If you don't have a lot of space, or you don't want to leave your background paper set up for a long time, then this is probably a good way to go if you only have small things to photograph. It allows you a lot of different angles for soft lighting. It's always soft lighting. You can move small objects in and out of it very quickly, so if you have a bunch of things you want to photograph, you don't want to spend a lot of time at it. Everything pretty much is calibrated the way you have it before. Just put your light where you had it before, put the box where you had it before, run your objects through the box, and you'll have it done. But let's change this up a little bit so that we can see another way of doing things. Here I've put a piece of silver board in as the surface and background for the subject. It's just a standard silver board that you could get at Michael's, and that provides some reflection of the object, just a little bit different than what we would normally see. You can also tell that there's a light behind the box that is producing a backlight on the top of the box, as well as a light hovering over the box that is lighting the box overall. We have our softbox in front that's providing the fill light for the front. Now if we zoom in and compose our photograph, it looks pretty good, except we seem to have a big problem with the light reflecting off the top of the box. So even though this isn't a highly glossy finish on the box, you'll still get, with any kind of finish, a reflection. There is a device called a polarizing filter that if you place in front of the lens, like I'm about to do here, that will get rid of that reflection. And as I turn it, it changes the amount of reflection that's allowed through. So this way you can see the grain of the wood, and it starts to look pretty good. Now these polarizing filters, you probably saw ads for them in your youth about using polarized sunglasses to drive and how it reduces the glare. Well, that's exactly what these things do. They're not real expensive, and like I'm holding it in front of the video camera lens, you can hold it or tape it with your, what's that, folks? Yes, your gaffer's tape, so that it stays onto the camera. Before we leave the subject of the studio, we've seen a few things being shot here. We've done it on an iPhone, we've used the DSLR. We really haven't said much about the difference between them, except for a few comments upstairs. So the major difference between the two is the lens. The sensors on both are of sufficient size for the type of work that you're doing, but the lenses are really quite different. So this is what's considered a normal, and I would put that in air quotes if I did air quotes, lens for a DSLR. It's a zoom lens that goes between 24 and 105 millimeters. That probably means nothing. The standard lens for any camera is the diagonal of the receiver or the sensor. In our case, that is probably 35 millimeters, maybe less. Well, definitely less, probably about 28 millimeters. So 24, the shortest focal length of this lens, would be normal. Now, if you were using a 35 millimeter film camera, the 24 would be quite wide. But the sensor in this particular camera is smaller than the 35 millimeter film size. There are digital cameras that have sensors the same size as 35 millimeter film size. So that's one thing. The fact that you can change focal length on this and not just switch between wide and wider. You can also zoom in to 105 millimeters, and that would allow you to change your point of view just a little bit. In other words, you could back up a bit, and while zooming in, it could change the shape of the box. The shape of the box is determined usually by point of view. So if you're looking down at a box, the verticals of the box would be converging toward the bottom. If you're looking up, it would be the opposite. That's not correctable in this kind of camera. It is correctable in some types of studio cameras. It's also correctable in Photoshop, and there are probably other programs where you can correct that. It's called a perspective correction, and it will change the angles of the verticals and the horizontals by changing what's essentially the vanishing point. That's one thing, and that's probably the smaller of the two issues that we can solve with this kind of a camera. The other one is the fact that we can stop down the aperture, that is, make the size of the iris in the lens smaller, which would give us more depth of field. So depth of field being how much is in focus from the front to the back. The more you stop the lens down, the more your depth of field broadens. And this could be important. With this, you can stop down. It has a number of what are called f-stops, but really that just means how small that aperture is going to be behind the lens. So that's the most important difference with this kind of camera as far as your kind of work is concerned. Let's look then about a couple other things about the studio itself. Obviously, the desired size of the studio depends on the size of the subject. So if you are photographing a dresser, I can tell you, you're not going to do it in this studio. You'll need a larger room and possibly a larger backdrop. You can buy a roll of seamless that's 9 feet wide, and that'll take care of your dresser more than likely. It won't take care of a car, but you're not restoring cars. But a dresser will fit in that space. What if you don't have a space big enough to put in a 9-foot backdrop? Well, a lot of you I've seen have been photographing your larger pieces of furniture in your house. And I would say that one way to improve that shot would be to take your softbox, move the furniture away from the wall, and light the furniture from the front side angle like we have on these. Moving it away from the wall darkens the wall, keeps the light on the furniture, and a fill light would be almost necessary because of the size of the object. Now let's go to the darkroom, the computer, and see what has to be done next, if anything. I'll show you on the iPhone and on the computer. They're both computers, and we'll see what we have to do to make it ready to be seen by the public. Here we are in my Photos app on my iPhone, we have this picture of the box. You notice on the top of the screen, you can click on Edit. So let's do that. We have a lot of adjustments we can make in this if we want to. However, the Photos app decided that this look of the box is fine. But if we don't like that look of the box, we can move on to exposure, click on the exposure. We can change the brightness of the image. That's okay. We can change the brilliance of the image, whatever that means. It's a kind of a contrasty thing that moves highlights and shadows around. We can also individually adjust the highlights. We can also make the shadows darker. We can change the contrast. And you might argue that that's the same as making the highlights brighter and the shadows darker. And in some instances it is, but this also includes the midtones, making it a little flatter, making a little contrast here. There's a brightness aspect to it. There's a black point. These are all fine details you probably don't care about. Saturation. This is interesting in that if you remove the saturation, you're removing the color. If you increase the saturation, well, you can see what that does. Vibrance. Similar to saturation, but it doesn't take it as far. Warmth. Tint. Usually takes it between red and green. Sharpness. Hard to tell here. Definition. Noise reduction. Noise reduction is if you shot this in low light and it has a lot of graininess in it because of the low light, you can reduce that amount of graininess. And vignette. Now this is nice. You can stylize your photograph a little bit. That's nice. Okay, so we did that, but let's go back to edit. And we just used the image adjustment icon at the bottom, the one on the left. Let's hit the one on the middle, and this one, rather than fine-tuning it, gives you a choice of changes you might want to make, using a whole set of different words: vivid, dramatic, mono. All right, let's keep it on the original. The next icon over is size and perspective. Now this is interesting too. What this first one does is it changes the angle of the entire photograph. Let's keep that the same. Now remember I mentioned before that in Photoshop you can change the perspective of the image. And that is true in this one also. Notice how I'm exaggerating the perspective in both directions. But as you recall, we were looking down on the object, so the verticals are not parallel. If we want the verticals parallel, we can move it a little bit. And using the grid, we can compare the lines to the box. Check that out. We just corrected our verticals. It's almost like having a view camera. You can also do it on the horizontals. We don't have to in this particular case. There. So now we have retouched the image. Finally, if you're into photography or you want to further refine your photographs on a bigger screen that you can actually see, then you can use your computer to make these adjustments. I'm using two applications here. Really, for the most part, you can get by with just one application, and that is Lightroom. It's an Adobe product, so naturally it costs something. Might cost a lot, I don't know. But Lightroom does really well to make preliminary edits on your photographs and even some fine-tuning as well. So let's take a look at what you can do with Lightroom. And here we have our image in Lightroom. You can see at the top right we have very similar controls that we had in our Photos application on the iPhone. We have this tint here, same thing as before. Exposure, you can make it brighter. But so far, nothing different than what we had on the iPhone, but you know that if you're using a computer to do this, you have these same capabilities. And it's actually the same algorithm that's operating these. Highlights. Shadows. Make them darker. Whites. Make the whites darker. Make them a little brighter. Blacks. Make them darker. Make them lighter. Now there's a control called texture, and we'll take a look at this close up. So if we look at this close up, we see that texture actually increases the contrast within the details of the photograph, and it brings out what appears to be texture. That's fun, so we can keep that up the way it is. Clarity is interesting in that it can make it real clear looking, or fuzzy looking. Dehaze is usually where you start when you have a very bright looking photograph, and it goes through all the controls in some way to take you where you might want to be. So it's a good way to start, but probably not something you want to do in the middle. Vibrance is kind of the, as we said before in the camera apps, in the camera photo app, mini saturation control. So it has a limit, and you recall that saturation, if you take it all the way to the end, it comes out black and white or monochromatic. If you take it all the way up to the top, it looks like your box is on fire. Okay, this also has a section for sharpening, but this is a pretty sharp image to begin with. We probably don't need to do anything in it, and be aware that this does not make up for any lack of focus in the camera. That's real important to know, because it's not going to do that. But if there's any kind of a digital fuzzing of the image, then it will help to bring that about by changing contrast within what looks like the grain of the image. Noise reduction is the same thing as before. In a badly lit image that has speckles in it, that noise reduction can help you. Now, the transform is probably the most interesting. Again, kind of does what a view camera does. So if you had to stop using a view camera because the scanner back for electronic imaging is so high in price, then you'd want to go to this. If we take our vertical lines and match them, make them parallel to the grid lines here, we will see that we have corrected the verticals in this box so they appear to be straight, even though we are looking down at the box. So that's real handy. You can do the same thing for horizontal, but you really have no reason to. So that in a nutshell is Lightroom. So one thing you can do is, now that you have your photograph zeroed in, this has not actually done anything to your image file. You can change your image file by exporting it. And for most of what you are trying to do, you want this image to show up on another screen. So if we go down to File Settings, and you go to JPEG, that's what you want it to be, is a JPEG. That's what most applications like Instagram will import. The color space you want is sRGB. It's already set to that. But there are other possibilities. Adobe RGB and ProPhoto RGB are used for printing. It gives a better representation in printing than sRGB does. sRGB is better suited to being shown on a computer screen. So keep that in mind. And then resize to fit. You can make that exported image any size that you want. You do want to export it to 72 pixels per inch. If you're going to print it, however, you would export it to 300 pixels per inch. But if you were going to print it, you wouldn't want to resize it at all. You want the biggest file you can get in order to reprint it accurately. So that's what you would do. You would export it, you would designate which folder you want it to go into, and there you'll have a new file that you can do with whatever you want. So that's Lightroom. There is no doubt that this is a lot to take in a very short period of time. And I hope you've gotten something out of it that would help you in making photographs of your work pieces.